The initial weeks of captivity were characterized by tension, silence, and wary glances, as hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war were processed through the barbed wire gates of the American camp. Most arrived in tattered uniforms with sweat and dirt embedded in the fabric after enduring months of combat and surrender. The lengthy marches, the ceaseless dust of island roads, and the relentless tropical heat had drained their bodies. Yet nothing could have prepared them for the peculiarities that awaited them inside. Following registration, medical examinations, and the distribution of essential supplies, they were herded into a large wooden structure with pipes overhead. The sight halted many of them in their tracks. The building resembled nothing they had encountered in the Pacific. Broad rows of nozzles jutted from metal lines, each equipped with a drain below. The American guards, brisk and efficient, signaled for them to undress and form a line. For the first time, many understood they were not merely being detained. They were expected to bathe. Confusion spread among the prisoners like a ripple. Bathing for Japanese soldiers during the war was infrequent, often improvised in rivers or seas, and always limited by shortages of supplies. Soap was regarded as a luxury. Yet here, in the custody of their sworn adversaries, they were being directed towards a structured ritual of cleansing. Some clutched their possessions as if anticipating a trick. Others whispered anxiously about the steam emanating from the pipes. They recalled stories shared by their officers prior to surrender, that the Americans were ruthless, that capture meant disgrace, and that prisoners would be treated worse than animals. Now gazing at the shining metal showers, they questioned whether this was a form of hidden cruelty. The guards, impatient with their hesitation, shouted commands in English and gestured once more. Shoes, belts, tunics, all had to be removed. One by one, hesitant hands unfastened buttons, and bodies marked by jungle campaigns stood exposed. The prisoners felt vulnerable, humiliated in front of strangers and one another. Nevertheless, they complied, grasping the bars of soap that were thrust into their hands. Then, the sound of water hissing filled the air. From the overhead pipes, streams of clean liquid poured forth, hot to the touch. The sudden warmth startled the men. For a brief moment they stood still, anticipating pain. Instead, as the water flowed down their backs and shoulders, washing away layers of dirt, an unusual calm enveloped them. Some closed their eyes, allowing the grime to swirl down the drains. Others cautiously rubbed the rough soap, as if testing whether it was genuinely permitted. Gradually, their initial fear transformed into quiet wonder. They had not experienced such heat and freshness in months, perhaps even years. In the islands where they had fought, water was scarce, showers were non-existent, and lice and disease were rampant. To stand beneath a stream of hot water without buckets, without shouting officers, and without restrictions was an almost unimaginable luxury. Here, in the hands of the enemy, they were cleaner than they had ever been in their own army barracks. Upon emerging, towels awaited them. Thick cotton towels were neatly folded in stacks. Many prisoners touched them as if they were relics from another world. They dried their bodies awkwardly, unaccustomed to such fabric. For the Americans, this was a standard camp procedure. For the Japanese, it was a revelation. They shuffled out, hair dripping, skin pink from the warmth, and an unmistakable murmur of astonishment circulated among them. The fear that had seized them upon entering the shower hall was replaced by confusion. Had their captors genuinely provided them with comfort instead of cruelty? That initial encounter with the camp showers lingered in their thoughts long after. It marked the beginning of a series of revelations that challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. The experience was not merely about washing away dirt. It was about confronting the disparity between what they had been told and what they were now experiencing. The modern shower, with its endless supply of hot water and soap, became a symbol of something much greater. The realization that captivity may not equate to degradation, but rather provide an unforeseen insight into the lifestyle of another civilization. Once the initial showers concluded and the prisoners returned to the barracks, a profound silence enveloped the room. They settled onto wooden benches, some grasping their neatly folded uniforms, while others dried their hair with thick towels, still uncertain if they had encountered a blessing or a concealed threat. Many refrained from making eye contact, as if engaging in open conversation could violate an unspoken rule. Deep within, however, a sense of unease gnawed at them. They had been cautioned repeatedly that being captured by Americans signified dishonor, torture, and death. In hushed briefings prior to battles, Japanese officers had illustrated images of sadistic enemy camps where starvation and maltreatment awaited. Yet the first action imposed upon them here was bathing with soap and hot water. To many this appeared suspicious, excessively kind, and overly civilized. One prisoner, a former naval mechanic from Yokosuka, recalled how Allied propaganda leaflets had portrayed smiling prisoners of war receiving food and rest. He had always dismissed those publications as fabrications intended to undermine Japanese morale. Now, standing clean for the first time in months, he reflected on those illustrations with a shiver. Could it be that some of them held truth? Yet another thought intruded upon his mind, darker and more horrifying. What if the showers were not intended for cleanliness at all? Rumors spread swiftly, particularly among those with sharper recollections of wartime propaganda. Some murmured the term gas chambers, drawing parallels to vague accounts of the Germans in Europe. Although few possessed detailed knowledge, the notion that Americans might utilize showers for some concealed cruelty spread rapidly in hushed tones, and the guards observed the hesitation. They monitored groups of prisoners lingering at the doorways, their expressions clouded with distrust. Orders were reiterated, and translators conveyed in broken Japanese that bathing was merely a matter of mandatory hygiene. However, suspicion did not dissipate easily. For men conditioned to think that surrender was a fate worse than death, any gesture of comfort was tinged with the flavor of deceit. They questioned whether the soap provided was tainted, or if the warmth of the water hid something malevolent. Some even opted to wash only partially, simply moistening their arms and backs before stepping away. The cultural disparity rendered the experience even more shocking. In Japan, bathing was deeply embedded in cultural practices associated with ritual purification in hot springs and communal baths. However, the war had obliterated that tradition, leaving soldiers unbathed for weeks, infested with lice, and battling persistent infections. In stark contrast, the camp showers were designed industrially. Lines of steel pipes and drains, efficient yet devoid of privacy, functioned like clockwork. For the Americans, this represented practical hygiene, nothing beyond that. For the Japanese, it appeared foreign, mechanical, and almost dehumanizing. It was a ritual stripped of its spiritual significance, reduced to something functional yet disquieting. For several days, discussions among the prisoners revolved around the same inquiries. Why would the Americans squander hot water on captives? Why provide soap, towels, and time when they could have simply left them in filth? Was it genuine generosity, or part of a broader strategy to mentally break them? Theories proliferated in the dimly lit barracks. Some contended that the showers served as a means of control, a tactic to weaken resistance by softening men with comfort. Others speculated that concealed chemicals might be mixed into the water. Fear lingered, bolstered by recollections of warnings from their superiors. Yet no punishment ensued. No hidden cruelty surfaced. The men returned to the barracks at night, still breathing, still alive, and cleaner than before. Gradually, suspicion began to diminish, supplanted by a quieter, reluctant curiosity. The Americans repeated the procedure the following day and the day after that. Soap continued to be handed out. Guards ensured that every man entered the shower hall, and still, nothing dreadful occurred. Doubt lingered, yet it was now intertwined with another emotion: confusion. What sort of adversary would be concerned about the cleanliness of their captives or the presence of lice? For individuals conditioned to view capture as a fate worse than death, this realization was as disconcerting as the showers themselves. The daily routine of hygiene gradually became integrated into camp life, although initially it felt imposed upon the Japanese prisoners. Each morning or evening, depending on the schedule, guards assembled them and escorted them to the shower hall. Upon arrival, they were given soap wrapped in paper, which emitted a strong chemical scent, unlike anything familiar from home, along with towels often stamped with military supply markings. The process was mechanical. Undress, step under the water streams, wash thoroughly, dry off, get dressed, and return. However, as days turned into weeks, the prisoners began to realize that this was not a temporary arrangement. Cleanliness had become a rule, a discipline enforced as rigorously as curfews and roll calls. The Americans conveyed hygiene standards through interpreters, using gestures to demonstrate the proper use of soap, insisting that the men scrub not only their arms and faces, but also their feet, hair, and the concealed folds of their bodies. Following this, lice inspections were conducted by medics who examined clothing seams and bedding. Delousing powder was distributed along with fresh undergarments. For the first time, many Japanese soldiers understood that the enemy regarded disease prevention with the same seriousness as they did food or weaponry. To the Americans, hygiene was not a luxury, but a fundamental necessity for maintaining order, health, and discipline within the camp. For the prisoners, this routine evoked a peculiar blend of humiliation and intrigue. On one side, they were stripped of their individuality, forced to wash on command like schoolboys. On the other side, they found that life free from incessant itching, sores, and infected wounds was unexpectedly bearable. A corporal who had fought on Guadalcanal recalled the weeks when his unit bathed only once in muddy streams, while tropical ulcers spread among his fellow soldiers. In contrast, after just a few weeks of mandatory showers, the sores on his legs began to heal, and the chronic cough that had troubled him diminished. It was a subtle, undeniable improvement, an irony that gnawed at his sense of pride. Language barriers initially caused endless confusion. Many prisoners did not comprehend when guards shouted instructions about washing hair or scrubbing feet, resulting in them performing only the bare minimum. When they attempted to skip steps, they were compelled back under the streams, watched with impatience until the soap lathered properly. Some resented this interference, muttering that it was degrading. Yet, even in their resistance, they could not deny the positive outcomes. Their uniforms, regularly laundered by camp procedures, no longer bore the foul stench of decaying fabric. Blankets emitted a faint scent of detergent rather than sweat and mildew. The barracks, once suffocating with the odor of unwashed bodies, became more bearable, even for those who never admitted it aloud. Gradually, the atmosphere of suspicion transformed into a routine. Prisoners began to look forward to the process, lining up with less reluctance. They learned to scrub more thoroughly, to dry themselves with care, and to fold the towels as instructed. Some even compared different types of soap, noting which ones lathered better or had a less harsh scent. It was a minor detail, but for men deprived of freedom, such comparisons evolved into a form of conversation, a means to occupy the long hours of idleness. Hygiene had shifted from a mere command to a shared ritual, something that quietly united them. What resonated most deeply with many was the realization that their captors expected them to uphold dignity, even in captivity. Being compelled into showers and provided with soap was not solely about controlling disease. It was about enforcing a certain standard of humanity. In the Japanese military, soldiers were instructed that comfort equated to weakness, and that the ability to endure filth and pain was a sign of honor. Now, under the discipline imposed by their captors, they learned that regular washing could be as integral to discipline as carrying a rifle. This conflict of values disturbed them, yet it also planted the initial seeds of an unwilling respect for the peculiar, unyielding order of their captors. The first instance of hot water cascading over their shoulders caused many Japanese prisoners to gasp, with some even recoiling as if scalded. The warmth, steady and controlled, flowed from the overhead nozzles in a manner they had never encountered before. For men who were used to makeshift washing in frigid rivers or hastily filled buckets, the sensation was nearly luxurious. Steam quickly rose, curling through the air and softening the harsh illumination of the barrack-style room. The soap, pungent and unfamiliar, foamed thickly on their skin, removing months of accumulated grime. Initially, they applied it tentatively, but soon with greater enthusiasm, marveling at how the lather adhered and rinsed away effortlessly. For some, the experience was overwhelming. They recalled how, during prolonged campaigns in the jungles, officers had cautioned them to conserve every drop of water, emphasizing that cleanliness was secondary to survival. On isolated islands, baths were infrequent. Soldiers would wipe themselves with rags, their skin perpetually sticky with sweat, salt, and dust. The rare occasions when hot water could be heated in cans or drums were regarded as exceptional blessings, shared among many men. Here, however, each prisoner stood beneath his own stream of warmth, as if such luxury were infinite. It was not merely bathing. It was immersion in an entirely different world. The towels provided afterward intensified the shock. Thick and absorbent, they were unlike the thin cloth soldiers had previously used in Japanese barracks, where men often had to share rags. Prisoners pressed the towels to their faces, inhaling the faint chemical scent of detergent. Their skin felt rejuvenated, with pores wide open, as the sticky residue of the tropics was finally rinsed away. This experience transcended mere physical relief. It awakened emotions that had long been buried. Some individuals reminisced about family baths from their homeland, recalling their mothers filling tubs with hot water before the war disrupted their lives. Others thought of public bathhouses, now mere echoes of a civilian life left behind. The camp showers revived those sensations, yet they were now tinged with the strangeness of captivity. The Americans approached this routine with a lack of sentiment, distributing soap and towels with the same straightforward efficiency as they did rations. For them, it was a matter of procedure, disease control, morale management, and maintaining order. However, for the prisoners, it became a subtle revelation. The irony was palpable. They had anticipated cruelty, yet instead, they found a comfort that surpassed anything they had experienced, even among their own forces. Some felt a sense of shame, thinking that such indulgence made them weaker. Others silently accepted it, thankful for a moment that allowed their weary bodies to regain a sense of humanity. Over time, the showers transformed their daily lives, moving beyond merely scratching at lice or ignoring festering sores. They discovered that hot water alleviated pain and accelerated healing. Their hair, once oily and tangled, became soft and manageable. The persistent odor of sweat that had clung to their uniforms faded, replaced by the subtle sharpness of disinfectant soap. Even the air in the barracks felt lighter, less stifling, as regular bathing diminished the smells of so many bodies confined together. The prisoners began to notice these changes with surprise, quietly recognizing that they were healthier than they had been during combat. This paradox troubled their thoughts. How could the enemy they had been taught to loathe provide them with care that their own army had withheld? The showers represented more than just cleanliness. They were evidence of a system so well organized and resource-rich that it could offer comfort even to captives. Standing beneath the streams of hot water, they could not help but feel a mix of envy and discomfort. It served as a reminder of the stark differences between this world and the one they had previously known, highlighting how Japan fell short in providing even the most basic dignity to its own soldiers. At night, as the barracks dimmed and the long lines of prisoners rested on their cots, discussions frequently reverted to comparisons with their past experiences in the Imperial Army. The focus was not on weapons or battles, but rather on the peculiar realization of hygiene. Men who had marched through Burma and fought in the jungles of the Philippines now quietly spoke of soap, towels, and the surprising comfort of hot water. This was not a subject that soldiers had ever deemed honorable, yet the disparity was too significant to overlook. In the Japanese military, bathing was a rare occurrence, performed only when conditions permitted. Officers emphasized endurance, the ability to disregard bodily discomfort, and the acceptance of dirt as a mark of resilience. Soldiers often went weeks without washing, their skin coated in filth, and their uniforms stiffened with salt from dried perspiration. Lice and fleas plagued the seams of their clothing, while tropical ulcers spread without treatment. The odor of unwashed bodies lingered during every march, in every camp, and throughout every night spent in the field. Complaining about such conditions was regarded as a sign of weakness, unworthy of a true warrior. However, in these American camps, cleanliness was mandated, as if it were a principle on par with discipline itself. One prisoner, a former sergeant, recounted how his unit in New Guinea had shared a single rusty basin of water among 30 men. They had managed to rinse their faces and hands, but the notion of proper bathing was out of the question. He bitterly contrasted this with the seemingly endless supply of hot water available in captivity. Another man remarked that back in Manchuria, his regiment had endured frostbite, not solely due to the cold, but also from wearing the same unwashed socks for months on end. Disease had incapacitated entire units more effectively than bullets. Now, here in America, every man scrubbed his feet daily, and medics examined them for infections as if they were esteemed patients. The irony was so intense that it caused a sting. This awareness quietly permeated the camp. Even those who held on to their pride could not refute the fact that their physical conditions were improving. Rashes diminished. Lice vanished. Sores healed. Stomachs that had previously twisted from parasites now calmed with regular washing and cleaner garments. Prisoners started to associate these enhancements with the routines they had once resisted. For the first time, they comprehended that hygiene was not a sign of weakness. It was a form of strength, a weapon against illness more formidable than mere stubborn endurance. The reflections were not solely physical but also cultural. Many recalled the rich traditions of communal bathing in Japan, the onsen in the mountains, and the wooden tubs in village homes. Bathing had once been an integral part of life, connected to family and ritual. War had stripped this away, reducing men to mere survivors in filth. Now in captivity, the enemy had returned to them what their own army had denied. This paradox disturbed them. Some spoke of it with nostalgia, reminiscing about their mothers heating kettles in the evenings. Others fell silent, feeling ashamed that it was not Japan, but America that had restored this sense of dignity. The guards failed to grasp the depth of this shock. For them, hygiene was a practical matter, linked to regulations and public health. They issued commands without emotion, never considering that the routine showers held such significant meaning for the prisoners. Yet within the wire fences, men lay awake, gazing at the rafters, realizing that the very framework of military life they had known was flawed. It was not strength to endure dirt. It was not honorable to disregard disease. They began to ponder. If America cared this much for the health of captives, how much more must it care for its own soldiers? This thought was unsettling, yet impossible to dismiss. Weeks turned into months, and the hygiene routine that once felt foreign began to etch deep grooves into the rhythm of captivity. Every man was aware of the day's schedule. Waking up, roll call, meals, and at designated times, the march to the shower hall. What had initially been met with skepticism gradually evolved into an almost unspoken expectation. The guards found it unnecessary to shout as loudly, and the prisoners no longer moved with such reluctance. They proceeded in organized lines, soap held firmly in their hands, towels draped over their shoulders, as if this had always been the norm. The change was not solely physical. It was also mental. The Japanese soldiers, divested of their weapons and their purpose, had regained something unexpected, a fragment of dignity. Their uniforms, regularly laundered, no longer bore the odor of decay. Their bodies, washed and inspected, were free from lice and festering wounds. Even the mirror-like reflections in small puddles after rain displayed healthier faces, with less gaunt cheeks and skin less marred by sores. This improvement was undeniable, even if they never voiced it. Cleanliness began to represent more than mere survival. It became evidence that they had not been entirely reduced to mere shadows of men. The effects resonated throughout the barracks. Coughing lessened. The incessant scratching of lice-infested scalps ceased. Blankets carried a faint scent of soap instead of mold. Guards occasionally remarked, sometimes with a smirk, that the Japanese prisoners appeared more orderly than when they first arrived. Some prisoners, embarrassed by this observation, still resisted internally, holding on to the belief that such routines were intended to soften them. Yet the reality was evident. They felt stronger, their wounds healed more quickly, their sleep became deeper, and their energy, though still constrained by captivity, grew more consistent. For some, this transformation evoked pride rather than shame. They began to fold their towels neatly after drying, to polish their boots with greater diligence, and to maintain the barracks in a clean and orderly fashion. It reminded them of the old traditions from home, of the meticulous rituals characteristic of Japanese households. Cleanliness, they came to understand, was not an act of yielding to the enemy. It represented the reclamation of parts of themselves, parts that had been buried beneath the mud and turmoil of war. Conversations evolved as well. Men who had once been too exhausted to engage in dialogue now exchanged quiet comments about the peculiar irony of feeling rejuvenated, realizing they were healthier in captivity than they had been in the field. American medics, practical and unsentimental, meticulously documented the improvements. There were fewer instances of dysentery, reduced infestations, and a decline in fatalities. For the Americans, this served as evidence that their system was effective. For the Japanese, it marked a moment of awakening. They could not ignore how their captors regarded hygiene as a matter of discipline and respect, viewing it not as a privilege, but as a necessity. This realization unsettled them, sharply contrasting with their own military values, where the endurance of filth was seen as a mark of honor. Here, the opposite held true. Cleanliness equated to order, and order signified strength. Gradually, the suspicion that had once surrounded the showers diminished almost completely. Men ceased to murmur about poison in the soap or hidden malice behind the water pipes. Instead, they began to look forward to the warmth, even developing a craving for it. The ritual transformed into something anticipated, a moment of physical relief in a life otherwise devoid of freedom. Some prisoners lingered under the streams longer than permitted, closing their eyes and allowing the water to flow over them, as if washing away not just dirt, but also the memories of their defeat. In the tranquility of these routines, many realized that hygiene transcended mere rules imposed by guards. It became a restoration of dignity, a means to reclaim their humanity, even within the confines of barbed wire. This subtle yet undeniable transformation altered not only their physical state, but also their fundamental understanding of endurance. By the time the autumn winds began to sweep through the camp and the days grew shorter, the discussions among the prisoners had evolved. No longer were there whispered debates about concealed poison or veiled cruelty. The discussion shifted to a different form of astonishment, the understanding that the daily practices of soap, hot water, and towels were not mere byproducts of confinement, but rather representations of something more significant. In the dimly lit barracks where men sat cross-legged on their bunks, they began sharing stories about their initial experiences with the showers, awkwardly laughing at their own fears and marveling at how habitual it had all become. One prisoner, who had once been a stern infantry officer, admitted that upon first entering the steaming chamber, he believed it was a trap intended to eliminate them. The others chuckled at this recollection, shaking their heads, although many acknowledged they had experienced similar apprehensions. Another man, younger and more loquacious, likened the camp showers to the grand public baths in Tokyo he had visited as a child. This comparison evoked murmurs of nostalgia, as the prisoners were momentarily transported back to a world of tiled floors and wooden buckets, to evenings when families and neighbors shared warmth together. The irony was not lost on them. It was in the hands of the enemy that fragments of those memories resurfaced. What troubled them most was not the showers themselves, but what they indicated about America. If this nation had sufficient resources to provide endless hot water for its prisoners, what must it offer to its own soldiers? If soap and towels were distributed so liberally here, what luxuries must be available at bases back home? The stark contrast with their own experiences gnawed at them. They recalled comrades who perished from infections due to a lack of clean water to cleanse wounds, soldiers who marched with lice infesting their scalps, men who deteriorated not only from starvation, but from the gradual degradation of their bodies by filth and disease. To recognize that the enemy placed such importance on hygiene led many prisoners to quietly concede, though never too audibly, that perhaps this was one of the secrets behind American strength. Discussions became increasingly candid around the communal tables as they consumed rations of bread, potatoes, or beans. Some expressed their astonishment openly. They confessed that prior to their capture, they had envisioned Americans as savage creatures. Instead, they found them to be organized and methodical, even in the seemingly trivial act of bathing. Others took this observation further, proposing that it represented an entire civilization founded on abundance and efficiency, one that possessed the luxury to extend such practices even to its adversaries. These notions ignited debates, as not all prisoners were willing to confront such uncomfortable realities. A sense of pride still lingered, and many reacted defensively to the implication that America was superior. Nevertheless, the evidence of their own clean skin, healed sores, and improved health was irrefutable. For some, this realization turned sour. They whispered that this comfort was intended to weaken them, to erode the resilience that had once characterized Japanese soldiers. Conversely, others experienced a different sentiment, a reluctant admiration. They began to perceive the showers not merely as a means of hygiene, but as a glimpse into the vast resources, industrial strength, and differing philosophy of their captors. In subdued tones, a few even acknowledged that the experience had altered their perceptions of the world beyond the confines of the camp. Thus, the showers, once dreaded as tools of cruelty, transformed into centers of enlightenment. They transcended the mere act of washing. They symbolized the stark contrast between two worlds, and the realization that their enemy's power lay not only in weaponry, but in life systems so advanced that even prisoners of war were drawn into their discipline. Years later, when many of the Japanese prisoners returned home after the conclusion of the war, the memory of their captivity remained intricate, marked by feelings of shame, relief, and confusion. Yet among the myriad impressions etched into their memories, one image endured with remarkable clarity: the showers. Men who had battled on remote islands, witnessing comrades fall victim to jungle ambushes and naval bombardments, primarily recalled the feeling of hot water cascading from pipes, the soap lathering in their hands, and the enforced regimen of cleanliness that initially disconcerted them but ultimately transformed their lives. Some former prisoners recounted this experience to their families, awkwardly explaining how the Americans mandated daily hygiene practices. Their wives and mothers listened in disbelief, questioning how an enemy could provide such care. Others chose to remain silent, hesitant to acknowledge that their captivity had afforded them comforts surpassing those offered by their own military. Nevertheless, in private, many conceded that the hygiene standards in the camps had shifted their worldview. The memory of an endless supply of hot water served as evidence of a civilization distinct from their own, modern, plentiful, and organized in ways that Japan, despite its discipline and traditions, could not replicate during the war years. This recollection was devoid of sentimentality. For the prisoners, showers had initially been peculiar, humiliating, and even intimidating, but over time those feelings evolved. As diseases diminished, wounds healed, and lice disappeared, the connection between cleanliness and strength became more pronounced. They came to understand that health was not merely a luxury, but a potent weapon, one that America wielded quietly yet effectively. In Barrick's discussions following their repatriation, some acknowledged that this lesson was perhaps the most significant they brought home, not regarding military strategies, but concerning the influence of modern living standards. Historians who later interviewed them observed how frequently showers were mentioned in their accounts. Unlike food or work assignments, which varied from one camp to another, the hygiene routine was almost universally practiced. It left a more profound impression than rations of bread or cigarettes. Men who had faced starvation in the field could endure scant camp meals without surprise. However, being provided with soap and towels, and being escorted into the warm, steamy rooms filled with hot water, was an unforgettable experience, as it was completely foreign to their wartime reality. This act did not represent indulgence, but rather an entirely different perspective, one in which the enemy acknowledged even their captives as human beings deserving of cleanliness. The long-lasting effects of this experience quietly persisted. Some former prisoners, upon returning to civilian life, continued to practice the habits they had adopted during their time in captivity. They began to wash more frequently, demanding soap even when it was in short supply. They instilled in their children the belief that hygiene was a matter of discipline rather than a sign of weakness. For these individuals, the camp showers were not simply routine activities. They were profound revelations, lessons that endured for decades. In hindsight, the memory was tinged with bittersweet emotions. It served as a reminder of their defeat, their surrender, and their reduction to the status of captives. Yet it also evoked memories of survival and an unexpected sense of dignity bestowed by an adversary they had been conditioned to despise. For many, this represented the paradox that characterized their experience of war, that in the very moment of humiliation, they had caught a glimpse of a form of modernity that remained etched in their minds. The showers transcended the mere provision of water and soap. They symbolized the realization that cleanliness, order, and even in captivity, care could transform a man's perception of his place in the world.